Welcome back to Dark Ascent. I'm Matthew, and today we're diving into the darkest tragedies ever recorded on Everest. From the couple who never made it down from their high-altitude wedding, to the influencer who gambled everything on one shot, only to realize that proof of the summit isn't worth the price of your life. On November 14th, 2015, climbers were high on the Lhotse face of Mount Everest, moving across a steep wall of hardened blue ice. Fixed ropes were their only protection against a catastrophic fall as freezing temperatures and strong winds swept the slope. At that altitude, thin air made even simple movements physically demanding. Clyden Bolton, 34, was attempting his first 8,000-meter peak after years of preparation. A petroleum engineer from Houston, he had spent 3 years training and approximately $85,000 on permits, logistics, and prior climbs. He had summited Denali and Aconcagua and was regarded within his team as careful and methodical. Bolton kept a detailed expedition journal, recording rope conditions, oxygen use, and turnaround times. Since arriving at base camp, he had been in open conflict with expedition leader Viktor Kozlov over safety margins and weather timing. Bolton argued that the forecast window was marginal and that sections of the fixed line above Camp 3 required replacement. He told teammates that if the expedition continued to ignore safety protocols, he would formally report the violations after returning from the mountain. Kozlov, a veteran leader with multiple Everest seasons, viewed Bolton's challenges as a direct threat to his reputation and livelihood. Several climbers later recalled tense exchanges between the two men in camp, with arguments escalating as summit day approached. On the night of November 13th, voices were heard outside tents at Camp 3. Bolton's assigned Sherpa declined to continue upward the next morning, stating he was uncomfortable with the atmosphere within the team. A few minutes later, headlamps were seen moving along the fixed lines above camp. Kozlov later said he was conducting final safety checks before the push. In the pre-dawn hours, according to this fictional account, Kozlov acted on his resentment. Using a climbing knife, he partially cut through fixed rope fibers at several critical anchor points. Each cut left enough strands intact to hold light tension, designed to fail only once a climber fully committed their weight. The locations were chosen at exposed traverses, where balance depended entirely on the rope system, and where a fall would be unrecoverable. Bolton clipped into the fixed line above Camp 3 and began traversing upward. Other climbers were spaced along the route, focused on their own movements. As Bolton leaned into the rope to cross an icy section, it suddenly failed with a sharp crack. He fell backward instantly. His ice axe skittered across the hardened surface without biting. Momentum carried him downslope, and he tumbled for an estimated 1,200 feet, striking ice and rock as he disappeared from view. Radio traffic erupted within seconds. Climbers above and below reported a fall, while base camp logged the incident as a rope failure. No rescue aircraft could operate at that altitude, and ground teams were forced to wait for improving conditions before attempting recovery. Bolton's helmet camera, later found with his body, recorded the moment the rope parted and the uncontrolled descent that followed. A recovery team reached him approximately 72 hours later, at an altitude just under 24,000 feet. The failed rope section was still attached to his harness. Examination showed localized, clean cuts inconsistent with gradual wear or rock damage. The coroner listed the cause of death as massive trauma from an uncontrolled fall on steep alpine terrain. An internal expedition review noted evidence of deliberate rope damage, but stopped short of issuing public criminal findings. Kozlov's guiding credentials were quietly withdrawn within this fictional narrative, and his expedition permit was not renewed. Bolton's family accepted a settlement from the expedition company under a non-disclosure agreement. Official summaries described the incident as equipment failure on the Lhotse face. Among climbers, the story circulated differently. Bolton's death was remembered not as an accident of weather or chance, but as a calculated act driven by revenge. One man's decision to silence a challenge, carried out in a place where even small betrayals are fatal. It was May 3rd, 2016, at Everest Base Camp, where the afternoon sun softened the glacial moraine into slush that soaked through boot seams. The temperature hovered around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, mild by Everest standards, with only occasional gusts strong enough to rattle tent fabric. Prayer flags stretched between cairns, snapped lazily in the thin air, their colors faded by seasons of ultraviolet exposure and wind. The camp sprawled across uneven terrain in clusters organized by expedition company, each group isolated by invisible boundaries of logistics and liability. Somewhere in the maze of orange and yellow domes, between the cooking tents and the medical station, Connor Walsh and Maya Reeves sat outside their tent, reviewing route maps for the third time that day. Connor was 32 years old, a software engineer from Seattle who had discovered climbing during a corporate team-building exercise 8 years earlier. What began as an awkward afternoon on an indoor wall had evolved into an obsession that redefined his identity. He quit his stable position at a tech firm after 3 years, took contract work that allowed flexibility, and spent every available dollar and vacation day pursuing vertical terrain. By his late 20s, he had climbed Rainier more than a dozen times, established new routes in the Cascades, and completed winter ascents in the Alaska Range that earned quiet respect in climbing circles. He approached mountains the way he had once approached code, methodically, with exhaustive preparation and backup plans for contingencies most climbers never considered. Maya was 30 years old, a wilderness EMT from Boulder who had grown up in a family that treated mountains as weekend destinations rather than exotic challenges. Her father had summited Denali twice before she was born, and she completed her first 14er at age 9. By 16, she was leading her own climbs. By 25, she had summited 5 of the 7 summits and worked as a guide on Aconcagua and Kilimanjaro. She possessed the rare combination of technical skill and physiological adaptation that allowed her to function at extreme altitude with less suffering than most climbers endured, where others gasped and stumbled above 20,000 feet. Maya moved with steady efficiency, her body processing thin air with the ease of someone born to high places. They'd met on Denali during a long weather hold at 14,000 feet, and the connection stuck because it wasn't built on small talk. Their relationship formed around decisions made in thin air, and it never really left the mountains. 18 months earlier, Connor proposed on Cho Oyu, and in March 2016, they married in a small ceremony in the Rockies. Everyone who knew them understood the honeymoon would happen somewhere high and dangerous. The decision unsettled both families. Connor's parents saw only risk and cost, unable to understand why anyone would begin a marriage by gambling against a mountain known for killing even experienced climbers. Maya's father understood the danger more intimately. Everest, he warned her, was less a technical challenge for each than a logistical gamble where weather, traffic, and timing decided outcomes long before skill could matter. Friends from the climbing community offered more nuanced warnings. Several had attempted Everest and turned back, recognizing that summit fever was the mountain's most reliable killer. One friend, who had turned back at the south summit due to deteriorating weather, told them the mountain rewarded discipline and punished ambition. He described bodies still frozen on the upper slopes, climbers who had pushed beyond turnaround times. The difference between summiting and dying often came down to the willingness to walk away. Both Connor and Maya thanked him for the advice, assured him they would climb conservatively, and privately dismissed the warnings as applicable to less experienced climbers. They chose a mid-tier operator with a respectable safety record. The lead guide, Ian Croft, was a conservative New Zealander with 9 Everest summits who treated turnaround times and oxygen discipline as non-negotiable. Their combined experience exceeded most climbers on the mountain, and Ian recognized it early, treating them as partners rather than liabilities. Connor and Maya agreed to all protocols, though their combined experience exceeded most climbers on the mountain. The trek from Lukla to base camp took 10 days, allowing gradual acclimatization. Both performed well, arriving on April 18th with strong appetites and none of the persistent headaches or nausea that plagued less adapted climbers. The expedition doctor found their oxygen saturation levels within expected ranges. They were physiologically suited to extreme altitude. Acclimatization rotations began in late April, climbing high, sleeping low, allowing the body to adapt. The first rotation took them through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, where they spent one night before descending. Both moved confidently through the chaotic terrain, navigating ladder crossings and crevasse systems with ease. The second rotation reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet in the western CWM, a glacial valley enclosed by Everest's southwest face and the steep walls of Nuptse. The sun's radiation, reflected by surrounding ice, turned the CWM into a furnace during daylight hours, with temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Climbers shed layers and consumed water at rates that seemed impossible at altitude. Connor and Maya reached Camp 2 after 6 hours of steady climbing, faster than most clients but slow enough to conserve energy. They spent 2 nights acclimatizing, eating freeze-dried meals and forcing down calories their suppressed appetites did not want. On the 3rd rotation, they climbed the Lhotse face to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, ascending steep blue ice on fixed ropes while their crampon points scraped against hard frozen surfaces. The climbing demanded sustained effort, each step calculated and deliberate, with rest stops every 100 feet to allow burning muscles and laboring lungs to recover. Maya moved slightly faster than Connor on steep ice, her years of guiding providing an efficiency advantage that showed most clearly on technical terrain. Connor followed steadily, his methodical pace reflecting the conservative approach he applied to everything. They reached Camp 3 after 7 hours and spent a single night before descending to base camp for final rest. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had climbed an 8,000-meter peak. Push high, retreat low, allow the body to adapt, repeat. The process took weeks, wearing down physical reserves as bodies cannibalized muscle and fat to sustain basic functions in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. Connor and Maya weathered the rotations better than most clients. Their weight loss was moderate, their appetites remained functional, and their sleep, though poor by sea level standards, was adequate for high-altitude recovery. Ian Croft monitored their progress and concluded they were among the strongest clients in the expedition. He mentioned privately to the Sherpa team that the couple would likely summit if the weather cooperated and they maintained discipline during the final push. The summit window opened on May 16th, 3 days of reduced wind and clear skies, the best opportunity of the season. Teams began moving upward from base camp, staging at higher camps for summit attempts that would begin from Camp 4 on the South Col. Connor and Maya departed base camp on May 17th, climbing through the Khumbu icefall in pre-dawn darkness before the sun destabilized Serex and increased rockfall danger. They moved efficiently, their bodies now accustomed to the altitude, and reached Camp 2 by early afternoon. After a night's rest, they continued to Camp 3, arriving on May 18th with enough daylight remaining to melt snow for water and prepare equipment for the following day's push to Camp 4. The climb from Camp 3 to the South Col required ascending the upper Lhotse face and traversing the exposed terrain of the Yellow Band and Geneva Spur. The route was less technically difficult than the climbing below, but far more dangerous due to the altitude. At 26,000 feet, they entered the death zone, where oxygen levels dropped below the threshold necessary to sustain human life for extended periods. Every hour spent above this altitude caused cellular damage that recovery could not fully reverse. Speed was not optional, it was survival. They reached Camp 4 at 1:30 p.m. on May 19th, giving them time to rest before the summit push that would begin near midnight. The South Col was a windswept plateau littered with the debris of decades of expeditions, abandoned oxygen bottles, torn tents, frozen human waste, and the occasional body too difficult to recover. The wind was moderate, around 20 miles per hour, cold but manageable. Connor and Maya forced down energy gels and soup, knowing their bodies needed fuel even as their suppressed appetites rejected food. They tried to sleep, but managed only fitful rest, their minds aware of what lay ahead. At 11:45 p.m., their Sherpa team woke them and helped prepare for departure. Mingma Dorje, a 38-year-old Sherpa with 7 Everest summits, would accompany them along with his partner Pazang Gyaltsen, who had summited 5 times. Both Sherpas were experienced and competent, and Ian Croft had assigned them to Connor and Maya precisely because the couple required minimal supervision. The plan was straightforward: maintain a steady pace, monitor oxygen consumption, reach the summit by midday, and descend immediately without extended celebration. They departed Camp 4 at 12:30 a.m. on May 20th, joining a line of headlamps that stretched up the triangular face toward the balcony. The climbing was steep but manageable on fixed ropes, with hard snow and occasional rock requiring careful crampon placement. The cold was severe, minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill pushing it lower, but their layering systems held. Connor moved slightly slower than Maya, his pace deliberate and controlled, while she climbed with the efficiency of someone whose body had found rhythm in thin air. The balcony arrived at 4:10 a.m., a small platform at 27,600 feet, where they rested briefly and changed oxygen bottles. Mingma checked their conditions and found both strong and alert. They were climbing faster than anticipated, putting them on track for an early summit, if the pace held. The decision was made to continue without extended rest. Above the balcony, the route traversed steep slopes and narrow ridges where fixed ropes provided security, but concentration could not lapse. A single misstep would send a climber tumbling thousands of feet down faces too steep to arrest. The darkness concealed the exposure, which was both mercy and danger. Easier to focus on the immediate task, harder to judge terrain features that daylight would reveal. The south summit appeared at 7:50 a.m., a false peak at 28,700 feet that marked the beginning of the most dangerous section, the traverse across the Cornice Ridge to the Hillary Step and final summit pyramid. Connor and Maya paused to rest while other climbers queued at narrow sections ahead. The sun had risen, illuminating the Himalayan panorama in sharp light that made the air seem thinner and the distances impossibly vast. They were less than 300 feet below the summit. During a routine check at the south summit, Mingma noticed Maya's gauge, sitting lower than expected. He examined the regulator and found no malfunction. The higher consumption likely reflected a slightly elevated flow setting, combined with the repeated stop and start pace forced by traffic above. He swapped her partially depleted bottle for a full one, making a note that they would need to monitor consumption carefully on descent. They reached the Hillary Step at 9:15 a.m., finding a queue of climbers waiting to ascend the near vertical rock and ice pitch that represented the final technical obstacle before the summit. Recent seasons had altered the rock and ice there, subtly reshaping the move but not eliminating the bottleneck. Connor and Maya waited patiently, conserving energy and staying warm while climbers ahead moved slowly up the exposed face. By 10:30 a.m., they had cleared the Hillary Step and were climbing the final summit ridge, a narrow spine of snow with exposure on both sides, falling away into Tibet and Nepal. The wind had increased to around 30 miles per hour, strong enough to require focused balance, but not dangerous enough to force retreat. Other climbers were visible on the summit ahead, tiny figures against blue sky. Connor Walsh and Maya Reeves reached the summit of Mount Everest at 11:04 a.m. on May 20th, 2016. They stood at 29,029 feet, the highest point on Earth, surrounded by a 360-degree panorama of peaks that stretched to every horizon. The sky was clear, the wind moderate, and the conditions as perfect as Everest ever offered. They embraced carefully, mindful of their oxygen masks and the narrow summit space, and allowed themselves a moment of triumph that justified years of preparation and the concerns they had dismissed from family and friends. Mingma took photographs with their camera, capturing images of the couple standing together on top of the world. They posed with flags they had carried, an American flag, a Colorado state flag, and a banner their friends had signed at the wedding. The celebration was subdued, appropriate for an altitude where every minute consumed oxygen and depleted reserves. Ian Croft had been clear about the protocol, 15 minutes maximum at the summit, then immediate descent. But 15 minutes extended to 20, then 25. Maya wanted additional photographs from different angles. Connor struggled briefly with a small video camera that had frozen in the cold, requiring time to revive it. Other climbers arrived, creating a crowded summit that required waiting for clear shots. The delays were small individually, each justified by reasonable desires to document the achievement, but they accumulated into time that eroded the margin between safe descent and disaster. They began descending at 11:43 a.m., 39 minutes after reaching the summit. The descent from the Hillary Step was slow due to traffic, with climbers still ascending while those who had summited tried to descend on the same fixed ropes. By the time they cleared the bottleneck and reached the south summit at 1:15 p.m., Maya's oxygen had dropped to reserve levels. Mingma checked her supply and discovered she had less than 90 minutes remaining at current flow rates. The South Col was at least 4 hours away. The math was suddenly unforgiving. Maya insisted she felt strong and could manage with reduced oxygen flow. Mingma agreed reluctantly, lowering her regulator to conserve the remaining supply. The decision was reasonable given their position. They were descending, which required less oxygen than climbing, and she was one of the strongest clients he had guided. But the choice removed margin for error. Any delays, any increased exertion, Any physiological stress would consume the buffer that kept her alive. Connor's oxygen was in better condition, with roughly 3 hours remaining. Pasang monitored him closely and saw no signs of distress. The plan was to descend together, with Maya on reduced flow until they reached Camp 4, where spare bottles waited. It should have been adequate. It would have been adequate if circumstances had remained stable. At approximately 2:40 p.m., descending below the balcony at around 27,200 feet, Maya stopped suddenly and leaned heavily on her ice axe. Connor, descending ahead of her on the fixed line, did not immediately notice. Mingma, following directly behind Maya, reached her within seconds and found her breathing rapidly despite the oxygen mask. Her movements had become uncoordinated, her legs trembling with the effort of supporting her weight. The symptoms indicated severe hypoxia, her brain and muscles starving for oxygen that her depleted supply could no longer provide. Mingma increased her flow to maximum, knowing it would exhaust the bottle within minutes, but hoping it would revive her enough to continue descending. Maya nodded when asked if she could keep moving, but her eyes had lost focus. Mingma recognized the expression. He had seen it before, on clients whose bodies were shutting down. Connor looked back and realized the line had stopped. Mingma signaled that Maya's oxygen was failing and that they had to get her down to Camp 4 immediately. Connor began climbing back up toward her, his concern overriding the protocol to continue descending efficiently. What happened next unfolded with the terrible logic of compounding errors. Maya's oxygen bottle emptied completely at approximately 2:55 p.m. Mingma removed his own oxygen bottle and fitted it onto Maya's regulator with practiced speed. The exchange left him temporarily without supplemental oxygen, but Sherpas were conditioned for brief exposure at extreme altitude in ways clients were not. Connor reached Maya's position and attempted to help support her, but 3 people, clustered on a narrow section of fixed rope, created congestion that further reduced efficiency. For several minutes, the change appeared to help. Maya's breathing slowed, and she managed a dozen careful steps downward, but the delay had already cost them too much time. Mingma, now climbing without oxygen, began to slow. His movements remained efficient, but carried less urgency, his body already making the calculations that hypoxia demanded. Traffic above forced repeated stops. Every pause bled warmth and strength. At 3:05 p.m., Connor had just surrendered the margin that had been keeping him alive. He removed his remaining oxygen bottle and held it toward Pasang, the exchange occurring without discussion. Pasang understood immediately what Connor was offering and what it would mean. The bottle was transferred to Maya, replacing Mingma's supply, which had been burning faster than expected at her elevated flow rate. Maya received Connor's oxygen and immediately showed continued improvement. Her breathing steadied further, her coordination returned, and she began descending again with Mingma's support. But Connor, already exhausted from the summit push, now began the descent on reserves alone. His body had little physiological buffer left once the oxygen was gone. For the first 10 minutes, his pace merely slowed. He moved with deliberate care, his crampon placements precise but requiring longer to execute. Pasang stayed close, watching for the deterioration he knew was coming. At 15 minutes, Connor's speech became slightly slurred when he responded to questions. At 20 minutes, he missed a crampon placement entirely, his foot scraping against the ice before finding purchase on the second attempt. His tunnel vision had already begun, his peripheral awareness collapsing inward as his brain rationed oxygen to essential functions. By 25 minutes, without supplemental oxygen, Connor's responses to Pasang's questions arrived several seconds late, his processing speed degrading in ways that signaled imminent collapse. His legs began to fail at 30 minutes, trembling visibly under his weight, each step a negotiation between will and physiology that Will was losing. At 3:40 p.m., Connor collapsed onto the snow and could not rise. Pasang checked his airway, felt for a pulse through layers of down, and waited longer than he should have before accepting what the mountain had already decided. Connor's eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow and irregular. His brain, deprived of adequate oxygen at extreme altitude, was shutting down. Pasang had no spare oxygen to give him. The only option was to descend immediately and hope a lower altitude would reverse the damage before it became permanent. Moving an unconscious climber on terrain, this steep required manpower that did not exist at that altitude. Even strong Sherpas rarely survived such efforts. The physics were merciless. Connor's weight, the angle of the slope, the distance remaining, and the oxygen demands of anyone attempting the carry made survival impossible for both the rescued and the rescuers. Maya, now breathing adequately on the oxygen Connor had sacrificed, understood what was happening when Mingma's radio traffic reached her position below. She stopped descending and tried to climb back to him, but Mingma stepped into her path and refused to let her pass. Mingma understood that stopping meant losing them both. Her screams carried across the empty slopes, raw sounds that altitude stripped of everything except grief. Connor Walsh lost consciousness completely at approximately 4:15 p.m. at 26,900 feet. Pasang stayed with him as long as the fading light and his own depleting oxygen allowed, covering him with an emergency blanket that the wind immediately began tearing away. By the time Pasang reached Camp 4 at 6:45 p.m., his face was blank, his report delivered in the flat tone of someone who had run this calculation before and knew the outcome never changed. Higher on the mountain, Maya was running out of time. By the time Mingma forced her downward past 26,500 feet, the oxygen Connor had surrendered was already running low again. The descent had taken longer than any of them could afford. Traffic above, failing light, and her own exhaustion had erased whatever margin remained. Her pace deteriorated steadily. What had begun as controlled steps became slow, mechanical movements that required constant prompting. Several times, she stopped without realizing she had stopped at all, her focus narrowing to the few feet of snow in front of her crampons. Mingma increased her flow briefly, but the bottle was nearly spent. At approximately 25,800 feet, Maya sat down without warning and did not respond when urged to stand. Her eyes remained open, but the engagement behind them had thinned to something distant. Severe hypoxia had begun its predictable work, judgment dissolving first, then coordination, then the basic will to move. Mingma tried to lift her, but Maya resisted with the dull, irrational strength common to critically oxygen-deprived climbers. She insisted she only needed a moment. Moments at that altitude were measured in survival, not minutes. Darkness overtook the slope before they could reach the tents. Temperatures fell rapidly, the wind strengthening as the last light disappeared behind the ridge. Without oxygen, without movement, and with her body already failing, Maya's chances narrowed with each passing minute. Sherpas departing Camp 4 at first light found her less than 1,000 vertical feet above the South Col, seated exactly where Mingma had been forced to leave her when his own oxygen approached depletion. Ice had formed along the edges of her mask, and one glove lay half removed, a common sign of advanced hypoxia, where the brain misfires and heat feels unbearable even as the body freezes. Connor Walsh and Maya Reeves were found within sight of the same descent route they had climbed together only hours earlier. The body recovery team determined neither could be safely retrieved from their positions and left them where they fell. Connor's parents later received a flag he had carried to the summit that was never displayed. The mountain had allowed them to stand together at the highest point on Earth, but it did not allow them to leave it. It was April 22nd, 2016, in the Khumbu Icefall on Mount Everest. Climbers crossed constantly shifting crevasses using aluminum ladders, the only safe route over deadly gaps. Freezing temperatures, strong winds, and thin air made every step exhausting, and even familiar routes were unpredictable. Diane Jalak, 41, a software architect from Portland, had been climbing for 15 years. She was attempting Everest for the second time after a previous attempt ended in altitude sickness. Jalak had earned a reputation for openly criticizing unethical guiding practices and had recently published a blog exposing expedition leaders for falsifying summit certificates and forcing clients into dangerous routes. Her post had gained attention in the climbing community, directly threatening Junjia's professional reputation and bookings. She had also documented multiple safety violations to Nepalese authorities, including improperly secured ladders and expired climbing permits. Junji Wei, 38, a veteran expedition leader, viewed Jalak's criticisms as a direct attack on his credibility. Climbers reported seeing him alone in the icefall the night before the incident, claiming he was checking route conditions. Junji deliberately loosened each ladder anchor at ladder bridge number 7, leaving just enough tension to hold initial weight, but fail under the dynamic load of crossing. He tested the anchors with his own weight to ensure the ladder would fail precisely at the midpoint, where a fall would be unavoidable. The sabotage was calculated, precise, and intended to punish Jalak for challenging his authority. Early the next morning, Jalak approached ladder bridge number 7. The aluminum ladder spanned a 40-foot crevasse, appearing unchanged from previous crossings. Her headlamp cut a thin beam through the dark icefall, and her movements were cautious but steady as she had crossed the same section safely 2 days earlier. She began stepping along the rungs, unaware that each anchor had been weakened to fail under her full weight. As Jalak reached the midpoint, both anchors simultaneously pulled free with metallic pings. She fell backward into the yawning crevasse, the ladder and loose anchors striking her body during the descent. The headlamp spiraled with her fall, illuminating the walls of ice as she tumbled uncontrollably. Her climbing partner's helmet camera captured the fall, along with Junji's voice faintly saying, "Equipment malfunctioned," before anyone could assess the situation. Jalak struck an ice shelf, 127 feet below the ladder, the impact driving metal screws through her chest and abdomen. Hypothermia quickly set in as she lay pinned among the broken ladder and ice debris. Rescue teams rigged lines and reached the crevasse 6 hours later, but she was already dead. The coroner determined her cause of death as multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and hypothermia. Investigation revealed the anchors had been deliberately loosened, with tool marks inconsistent with normal ice conditions. Junjie radioed base camp, claiming the ladder had failed due to ice movement. His guiding license was suspended, but he left Nepal before formal charges could be filed, quietly avoiding any direct legal accountability. Official reports only briefly mentioned equipment failure in the Khumbu icefall, giving little indication of the true cause. Jalak's family, devastated by the loss, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Junjie and his expedition company. The case was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, including terms that prevented public discussion of Junji's actions. In the climbing community, the incident quickly became a cautionary tale. Fellow mountaineers noted the unusually precise sabotage and the way it mirrored personal vendettas rather than accident or oversight. Guides who had worked with Junjie reported that he became increasingly aggressive toward clients and whistleblowers after the lawsuit, intensifying the perception that his actions were premeditated. It was March 15, 2016. The morning fog clung to the lower slopes of Mount Washington's Tuckerman Ravine, rolling up from the valley floor in thick, gray waves. Ashley Novak was a 34-year-old software engineer from Boston who had completed avalanche training and invested in high-quality safety gear. Scott Brennan, 41, was an insurance adjuster from Hartford who specialized in natural disaster claims. His recent divorce had prompted him to seek new backcountry experiences. Oiken and his methodical nature made him the group's planner. Stephanie Mills, 28, worked as an emergency room nurse in Burlington. Her medical training had exposed her to mountain rescue cases, teaching her to trust her instincts about dangerous situations. Their guide, Ryan Whitman, presented himself as the epitome of mountain professionalism. At 42, he had been guiding backcountry skiing trips for 15 years, building alpine adventures from a one-man operation into New Hampshire's most respected guide service. His professional certifications hung prominently in his North Conway office, surrounded by photos of successful trips and testimonials from satisfied clients. Whitman's reputation for safety had never been questioned. He had guided over 800 trips without a single serious incident, earning recognition from local outdoor councils for his contributions to backcountry education. But beneath this professional exterior, Whitman was drowning in crisis. His gambling addiction had escalated from weekend casino trips to daily online poker and sports betting that drained his accounts. By February 2016, he owed a substantial debt to a Boston bookie whose associates had made clear that Friday, March 18th, was the absolute deadline for payment, with consequences extending beyond financial ruin. Tuckerman Ravine sits at 3,800 feet elevation in a natural bowl formation with steep headwalls and terrain traps that can concentrate avalanche debris into deadly burial depths. During winter storms, the ravine acts like a massive snow collector, with winds depositing unstable layers on the slopes. Early that morning, Whitman sat in his truck at the visitor center, staring at his phone screen, displaying the weather station's avalanche advisory. The report warned of considerable avalanche danger on wind-loaded slopes above treeline, with recent avalanche activity observed on east and southeast-facing slopes. Wind slabs up to 3 feet thick were possible on lee slopes, and travel in avalanche terrain was not recommended. The advisory identified the March 10th crust layer as a particular concern, noting that several natural avalanches had been observed on similar aspects during the previous 48 hours. Two other established guide services had already made the decision to cancel their scheduled trips that morning. Jim Morrison, owner of a competing guide service and a 20-year veteran of Mount Washington guiding, had called Whitman early that morning to discuss conditions and share his decision to cancel. Morrison specifically mentioned the wind loading he had observed during a reconnaissance trip the previous afternoon and his concern about the instability of the current snowpack. He suggested that Whitman consider postponing his trip until conditions improved, noting that client safety should always take precedence over business considerations. Shortly after, Whitman received a radio call from the weather station providing an updated conditions report. The meteorologist on duty, Lisa Davis, had been monitoring conditions since midnight and reported deteriorating visibility, increasing winds, and no signs of improvement. Davis specifically advised against backcountry travel above tree line, noting that the combination of poor visibility and unstable snow conditions created an unacceptable risk level. Whitman acknowledged the transmission with a brief response but continued with his preparations, knowing that each warning he ignored brought him closer to a decision point he wasn't prepared to face. The financial pressure weighing on Whitman's mind was intensified by threatening text messages he had received since dawn. The bookie's associates had already visited Whitman's office twice in the previous week, making it clear that his reputation and business were at risk along with his physical safety. The money from this trip would still leave him far short of what he owed, but it would demonstrate good faith and might buy him additional time to find a solution. Whitman met his 3 clients at the visitor center. Maintaining his professional demeanor, he conducted a thorough equipment check, ensuring each client had proper avalanche safety gear. All 3 carried standard transceivers, probes, and shovels, with Novak's equipment being particularly high quality. Whitman's own gear was professional grade and meticulously maintained. The group began their ascent through dense forest that provided initial shelter from the wind. Whitman used this section to assess his client's skiing ability, noting that all 3 were competent intermediate skiers. The conversation was educational, with Whitman discussing avalanche formation and recognition. After climbing for about half an hour, they reached a small shelter area that serves as a waypoint for most ravine ascents. The shelter provided a brief respite from the wind, and Whitman used the stop to check weather conditions and reassess the group's energy levels. Visibility had improved slightly in the sheltered area, allowing glimpses of the ravine's lower slopes, but the upper mountain remained shrouded in fog and blowing snow. Whitman's radio crackled with transmissions from other parties in the area, including a group of experienced local skiers who were turning back due to conditions. He acknowledged these transmissions but didn't share their content with his clients, maintaining an optimistic outlook about the day's prospects. As the group continued climbing toward treeline, they encountered a party of 4 experienced backcountry skiers descending rapidly from higher elevations. The lead skier was Brian Stone, a certified avalanche instructor from Jackson who had been skiing Mount Washington for over a decade. Stone approached Whitman directly and described conditions above treeline. He had observed shooting cracks in the snow, linear fractures that propagate across the snow surface when disturbed, indicating unstable conditions ready to avalanche. Stone specifically mentioned seeing recent avalanche debris in the ravine's main bowl and noted that wind loading had created dangerous slab conditions on all eastern aspects. Stone's warning was detailed and specific, based on direct observation rather than theoretical concerns. He described how his group had triggered several small collapses while ascending, hearing distinctive sounds that indicate layer failure in the snowpack. Most concerning, he had observed a natural avalanche release on a slope similar to their intended route, noting that the debris had run much farther than expected due to the terrain trap effect of the ravine's gullies. Stone recommended that Whitman's group turn back immediately, emphasizing that the current conditions were among the most dangerous he had seen in years of skiing the mountain. Whitman listened to Stone's warning with apparent attention, asking several technical questions about snow conditions and wind patterns that demonstrated his knowledge of avalanche science. However, when Stone finished his report, Whitman thanked him for the information, but dismissed the warning to his clients with a casual explanation. He told Novak, Brennan, and Mills that Stone's group didn't have his level of experience reading these specific conditions, and that local knowledge developed over 15 years trumped textbook caution. Whitman explained that Mount Washington's conditions could vary dramatically across different aspects and elevations, and that his intimate familiarity with the mountain allowed him to identify safe routes that less experienced parties might miss. This dismissal of expert advice represented a crucial decision point where Whitman's judgment became fatally compromised by external pressures. Under normal circumstances, he would have carefully considered Stone's observations and likely made the conservative decision to turn back. His 15-year safety record had been built on exactly this type of cautious decision-making, prioritizing client safety over client satisfaction when conditions warranted. But the financial pressure he faced had created a cognitive bias that caused him to rationalize continuing despite clear evidence of danger. The fee from this trip had transformed from income into a lifeline, making the decision to turn back feel like an impossible choice rather than a prudent one. As they climbed higher, the group reached where the forest began to thin and the full force of the wind became apparent. Visibility had worsened significantly, and wind gusts were strong enough to require the clients to lean into their poles for stability. The temperature had dropped considerably, and the wind chill made exposed skin painful within seconds. Snow conditions had changed dramatically from the lower elevations, with the soft powder giving way to wind-crusted surfaces that showed clear signs of recent loading and redistribution. Novak was the first to express growing concern about the deteriorating conditions, noting that the wind was much stronger than Whitman had predicted during their pre-trip briefing. Her software engineering background had taught her to trust data over optimism, and the evidence of her senses contradicted Whitman's assurances about improving conditions. She pointed out that visibility was getting worse rather than better, and suggested they consider turning back while they could still descend safely. Her tone was respectful but firm, reflecting her analytical approach to problem solving and her growing unease about the gap between expectations and reality. Whitman's response contradicted his usual cautious approach to mountain guiding. He assured Novak that his 15 years of experience in these mountains made the trip safe, explaining that Mount Washington's weather was notoriously unpredictable, but that he had learned to read its subtle signs. He pointed out that they were committed to the route now that they had climbed this far, and that turning back would mean losing the entire day without experiencing the unique skiing that Tuckerman Ravine offered. What he didn't mention was that his phone had been buzzing with increasingly threatening text messages throughout the morning. The psychological pressure on Whitman was intensifying with each step upward. This sunk cost fallacy is common in mountain accidents, where the desire to justify previous efforts overrides rational assessment of current conditions. External pressures had compromised his normally sound judgment. Late in the morning, the group broke above treeline into the full fury of Mount Washington's notorious weather. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the temperature felt brutally cold with the wind chill. The transition from forest to alpine zone was dramatic and immediate, with the sheltering effect of trees giving way to the mountain's raw power. Wind gusts created ground blizzard conditions that made communication difficult and navigation challenging. The snow surface showed unmistakable signs of wind loading, with smooth, pillow-like formations that experienced backcountry travelers recognize as dangerous wind slabs. Brennan, drawing on his insurance background in assessing natural disaster damage, commented that the snow looked fundamentally different from what they had encountered lower on the mountain. He noted its hard, hollow sound when struck with ski poles, a classic indicator of wind slab formation that Whitman would normally have used as a teaching moment about avalanche recognition. The snow's surface had a polished, almost ceramic appearance that reflected the intense wind action of the previous days. When Brennan probed the snow with his pole, it penetrated easily for the first few inches before hitting a hard layer that produced the distinctive hollow sound of an unstable wind slab. Mills, whose medical training emphasized systematic risk assessment and early intervention, suggested they reconsider the route given the dramatic change in conditions. Her experience in emergency medicine had taught her to trust early warning signs rather than hope for improvement, and every indicator suggested that conditions were deteriorating rather than stabilizing. She pointed out that their visibility was now so limited that they couldn't assess the terrain ahead, making it impossible to identify safe routes or potential hazards. Mills also noted that the wind was making communication difficult, which could prove critical if they encountered problems and needed to coordinate a response. Whitman acknowledged their concerns with what appeared to be careful consideration, but his response revealed the depth of his internal conflict. He insisted they were only minutes from the planned descent route, and that turning back now would mean losing the entire day and the unique experience that Tuckerman Ravine offered. He explained that the conditions, while challenging, were within acceptable parameters for experienced guides, and that his knowledge of the terrain would keep them safe. Behind his confident facade, turning back meant facing his creditors, empty-handed and accepting consequences that extended far beyond a canceled ski trip. The decision to continue represented a complete breakdown of the risk management principles that had guided Whitman's career. Every element of his training and experience argued for retreat. Deteriorating visibility, increasing wind, unstable snow conditions, and client concerns all pointed toward the conservative choice. But the financial pressure had created a parallel decision-making process where the immediate need for income overrode long-term considerations of safety and reputation. Whitman positioned himself at the front of the group and began breaking trail toward the headwall's eastern slope, the exact terrain the avalanche advisory had identified as most dangerous. Soon after, the group reached the headwall's eastern slope, entering the heart of Tuckerman Ravine's avalanche terrain. The wind had sculpted the snow into a series of wind slabs that extended across the entire face of the ravine, creating a landscape that looked deceptively smooth and inviting, but harbored deadly instability beneath its surface. The slope angle had increased dramatically, well within the range where wind slabs become prone to failure. Visibility remained severely limited, making it impossible to see the full extent of the slope or identify potential escape routes. Despite the obvious danger signs, Whitman's financial desperation overruled his professional judgment. Whitman called a halt and announced his intention to demonstrate proper technique for skiing wind-affected snow. This decision reflected both his genuine desire to educate his clients and his need to justify the risks they were taking by showing that the conditions were manageable. He positioned Novak, Brennan, and Mills in what he described as a safe zone, below a small ridge feature that he believed would protect them from any potential slide activity. The location was chosen based on his understanding of avalanche dynamics, but his assessment failed to account for the full extent of the unstable area and the potential for the slide to propagate beyond its initial boundaries. Whitman's plan was to ski a conservative line down the slope, demonstrating how to read the snow conditions and adjust technique accordingly. He would make several turns to test the snow's stability, then return to guide his clients down the same route if conditions proved acceptable. This approach had worked successfully on hundreds of previous trips, allowing him to assess conditions while maintaining client safety. However, the current snowpack conditions were fundamentally different from anything he had encountered in his 15 years of guiding, with instabilities that extended far beyond what his experience had prepared him to recognize. As Whitman prepared to descend, he conducted a final assessment of the snow conditions. He found the wind slab layer overlying a weaker layer from the March 10th warming event, with poor bonding between layers. Under normal circumstances, this would have been sufficient evidence to abandon the descent, but his compromised judgment led him to rationalize continuing. Whitman pushed off from his position and began his descent. His first few turns appeared controlled and smooth, following a line that avoided the steepest sections of the slope. The snow felt firm under his skis, and the wind slab seemed to be holding together despite the underlying instability he had observed, suggesting the slope was stable. This assessment would prove fatally wrong within seconds. On his fourth turn, Whitman's skis cut through the wind slab and into the weaker layer beneath, creating a significant disturbance in the snowpack. The initial fracture was barely audible, but the fracture began to propagate beyond his ability to control or escape. The failure of the weak layer created a chain reaction that spread across the slope, turning a localized disturbance into a massive avalanche in seconds. The fracture line propagated across the slope in an instant, creating a deep slab that began moving as a cohesive unit. The initial movement was slow, almost gentle, but the slab quickly accelerated as gravity overcame the remaining bonds, holding it to the slope. Whitman attempted to ski out of the slide path using a technique called skiing off the slab that involves rapid acceleration to escape the moving snow. However, the size and speed of the avalanche made escape impossible, and the moving snow knocked him off balance within seconds of the initial fracture. The slab accelerated rapidly down the steep slope, reaching dangerous speeds within moments. Whitman was initially swept along with the debris, his bright red jacket visible against the white snow. However, the fracture had started directly beneath his skis, and the initial movement threw him sideways, off the main slab. He tumbled roughly, but was ejected from the primary debris flow after being carried only a short distance, coming to rest against a cluster of rocks that had acted as a natural barrier. Battered and disoriented, Whitman found himself partially buried, but alive on the edge of the avalanche path. Novak, standing closest to the fracture line in what Whitman had designated as the safe zone, was pulled into the avalanche as it widened beyond the initial break. The propagation of the fracture extended far beyond what Whitman had anticipated, reaching the ridge feature where his clients were positioned, and continuing beyond. Novak had only seconds to react as she saw the snow surface fracture and begin moving toward her position. She attempted to deploy her avalanche airbag pack, but the rocky terrain and speed of the slide rendered any safety measures ineffective. The avalanche carried Novak down the slope before she impacted a series of rocks that had been exposed by previous wind scouring. The collision occurred at high speed, creating massive trauma to her chest and head that would prove immediately fatal. Her airbag pack could not protect against the rocky terrain that characterized this particular slide path. The impact threw her clear of the main debris flow, leaving her partially buried, but visible on the surface near the edge of the avalanche path. Brennan, positioned slightly higher than Novak, had more time to react as he watched the avalanche develop and spread toward his position. His insurance background had taught him to assess dangerous situations quickly, and he immediately recognized the severity of the threat bearing down on him. Brennan attempted to ski laterally out of the slide path, using a technique he had read about in avalanche safety literature. However, his limited backcountry experience and the speed of the avalanche's propagation made escape impossible. He managed to travel only a short distance before being overtaken by the moving snow. Brennan's last visible action before disappearing beneath the avalanche was reaching for his avalanche transceiver to ensure it was transmitting properly. This reflexive response demonstrated his understanding of avalanche rescue procedures, even in the face of mortal danger. The avalanche swept him into the main debris flow, where he was carried down the slope and into the terrain trap that concentrated the snow into dangerous depths. Unlike Novak, who was thrown clear by her impact with rocks, Brennan remained within the main body of the avalanche and was completely buried when the debris came to rest. Mills, positioned highest on the slope, attempted to ski clear when she saw the fracture develop. However, the avalanche's propagation was faster and wider than anyone anticipated. Despite her quick reaction and medical training that taught her situational awareness, the expanding debris field caught her before she could reach safety. Mills was swept into the slide and carried down the slope, becoming the third victim of the massive avalanche. Like Brennan, she was carried deep into the main debris flow and into the terrain trap, where she would be completely buried when the snow came to rest. The avalanche came to rest in a fan-shaped deposit that was wide and deep in the center, with the deepest accumulations occurring in the gully where multiple victims had been carried. The total volume of snow involved in the slide was massive, creating a debris field that would require organized rescue efforts and specialized equipment to search effectively. 3 members of the party were buried beneath tons of compressed snow, their transceivers transmitting signals that would go unheard for hours. Whitman struggled to free himself from the snow that had partially buried his legs, his body aching from the violent tumble. As he gained his bearings, the full horror of what had happened became clear. The avalanche had carried his 3 clients deep into the terrain trap below, burying them under tons of compressed snow. He immediately activated his avalanche transceiver and began a frantic search, but the scale of the debris field and his own injuries made effective rescue impossible. After nearly an hour of desperate digging in the wrong locations, Whitman finally managed to get a weak cell phone signal and called 911. His voice was barely coherent as he reported the avalanche and his client's disappearance. Professional rescue teams arrived within 3 hours, but by then, any hope of survival had passed. Novak was found dead after 3 hours of searching, partially buried near the edge of the debris field, where she had been thrown clear after impacting rocks. Brennan was located deeper in the debris field, having died from asphyxiation after being completely buried. Mills was found last, in the deepest part of the terrain trap, where she had died from asphyxiation after being buried under several feet of compressed snow. The investigation revealed evidence of Whitman's gambling debts in his truck, including threatening text messages and documentation of his substantial debt with a Friday deadline. Phone records showed multiple creditor contacts leading up to the trip, painting a clear picture of extreme financial pressure. Whitman's decision to continue despite multiple avalanche warnings and expert advice was thoroughly documented and criticized. The coroner ruled all 3 client deaths accidental, but cited gross negligence by Whitman in exposing clients to known hazardous conditions. Novak died from blunt force trauma from her impact with rocks, while Mills and Brennan died from asphyxiation due to burial under compressed snow. Criminal charges were filed against Whitman for criminally negligent homicide, and he was stripped of all guiding certifications. The families pursued wrongful death lawsuits against both Whitman and his business, though his insurance coverage proved insufficient for the scale of the losses. It was May 19, 2017, on the summit ridge of Mount Everest. The death zone stretched above 26,000 feet, where freezing winds and thin air made every step a struggle. Climbers relied entirely on supplemental oxygen and careful pacing to survive. Even minor equipment failures could be fatal. Visibility was limited, the terrain exposed, and the slightest misstep carried the risk of a deadly fall. Jenkin Adara, 38, a firefighter from Denver, had been climbing with Paul Hendricks for 8 years. He had recently inherited $200,000 from his father and had loaned Hendricks $75,000 to fund his Everest expedition after Hendricks's business failed. Adara had pressed Hendricks repeatedly for repayment, even threatening legal action when Hendricks claimed he could not pay. Though they had climbed together for years, Adara confided to other climbers that he no longer trusted Hendricks with financial or life-critical matters and planned to end their climbing partnership after Everest. Paul Hendricks, 36, had grown increasingly bitter. He felt humiliated by the constant pressure to repay the loan and resented Adara's authority. According to this fictional account, Hendricks studied oxygen systems extensively and learned exactly how to create a slow leak that would appear accidental. Climbers later recalled Hendricks asking unusual questions about regulator mechanics and Adara's insurance policies. The night before the summit push, Adara's Sherpa guide noticed Hendricks handling Adara's oxygen gear, assuming he was helping, unaware that Hendricks was sabotaging it. During the early morning ascent toward the summit, Adara's primary oxygen regulator began losing pressure unexpectedly. At first, he noticed subtle drops in flow, causing mild shortness of breath. He adjusted the mask and switched between regulators, but the supply continued to dwindle far faster than anticipated. Each step became heavier and his movements slower as the lack of oxygen began to sap both strength and coordination. About 300 feet below the peak, the regulator fully failed, leaving Adara gasping for air on the narrow ridge. His vision blurred, his balance faltered, and severe altitude sickness set in. Confusion, staggering, and sharp headaches made even basic steps dangerous. Hendricks claimed his own system was malfunctioning and refused to share oxygen, despite having full bottles, leaving Adara isolated in the most critical section of the climb. Every attempt to descend became more treacherous, the sheer drops on either side offering no margin for error. Within minutes, Adara's condition worsened dramatically. Cerebral edema overwhelmed him, clouding judgment and causing him to stumble repeatedly. Disoriented and slipping on the icy ridge, he could no longer maintain his footing. Hendricks's helmet camera later showed him checking Adara's pulse, confirming the unconsciousness, before he continued alone toward the summit. Adara collapsed on the ridge, just 280 feet from the top, the thin air and freezing temperatures ensuring that survival was impossible. Hendricks radioed base camp later, reporting that Adara had succumbed to altitude sickness, and no rescue was attempted due to location and weather. Adara's body was recovered 6 weeks later during a commercial expedition. The coroner listed cerebral edema and hypoxia as the cause of death, but the damaged regulator was noted as a contributing factor. Tool marks on the valve indicated deliberate puncture, inconsistent with accidental damage or normal wear. Hendricks collected Adara's life insurance payout as the designated beneficiary and never repaid the loan. Official reports briefly listed the death as high-altitude cerebral edema near the summit, with no mention of foul play. Among climbers, the story circulated as a chilling example of revenge at extreme altitude, one partner eliminating another when resentment and greed outweighed loyalty, and the mountain left no room for mercy. It was May 18, 2016. The summit push window on Mount Everest had opened just days earlier, and the South Col route was crowded with climbers eager to reach the top. At 26,000 feet on the South Col, more than 50 climbers from a dozen expeditions were preparing for their summit attempts. Gerald Huxley was 54 years old, a millionaire from Boulder, Colorado, who had made his fortune in commercial real estate development across the Mountain West region. He had built and sold a portfolio of shopping centers and office complexes over 25 years, finally liquidating everything 3 years earlier. The sale had left him with more money than he could spend. Retirement didn't suit him. He needed goals, challenges, something to work toward. Everest became that goal. For months, he hired consultants to evaluate expedition companies, paid experienced climbers for advice sessions, and had specialists create detailed training and equipment plans. He told friends and family during a gathering that he and his son, Russell, would be climbing Everest together the following spring. Russell Huxley was 21 years old. He dropped out of a private university 18 months earlier after failing multiple classes and losing interest in his business degree. Since then, he'd been drifting, traveling through Southeast Asia for months, working briefly at a ski resort in Colorado, then spending 4 months in South America. All of it was funded by his father's money. Russell was athletic and naturally coordinated, drawn to activities that provided immediate thrills. Surfing, rock climbing, mountain biking, base jumping. But he lacked discipline and follow-through. He would obsess over something for weeks, then abandon it completely. When Gerald proposed they climb Everest together, Russell's initial reaction was skepticism. He had no serious mountaineering experience. He'd climbed Kilimanjaro on a guided trek 2 years earlier, a 10-day trip that required no technical skills. But Gerald was insistent. This would be their shared achievement, the thing that bonded them, the story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. Russell agreed, not because he wanted to climb Everest, but because saying no to his father had never been a realistic option. They hired an expedition company and began training several months before departure. Gerald hired a personal trainer who specialized in high-altitude preparation and had a custom program designed for both of them. They trained at altitude in Colorado, spending weekends above 14,000 feet. They practiced using crampons, ice axes, and fixed ropes at a climbing facility. Gerald followed the program obsessively, treating missed workouts like business failures. Russell trained inconsistently. He'd go hard for a week, then skip sessions when he lost motivation. By the time they left for Nepal, Gerald was in the best shape of his life. Russell was fit but underprepared. They spent 6 weeks acclimatizing, making multiple trips up and down the mountain to allow their bodies to adapt to the thinning air. Neither man had ever climbed above 20,000 feet before arriving in the Himalayas. Their guide was an experienced mountaineer who had summited Everest 11 times over 15 years. Mount Everest's summit sits at 29,029 feet, well into what climbers call the death zone, an altitude where the human body cannot acclimatize and begins shutting down from oxygen deprivation. At that elevation, every step requires monumental effort. The heart races to pump oxygen-depleted blood. The lungs heave but cannot extract enough oxygen from the thin air. The body cannot recover or adapt. It can only deteriorate. Most climbers use supplemental oxygen above 26,000 feet, but even with it, physical and cognitive function decline rapidly. Their guide expressed concerns from the beginning of the acclimatization process. During the first rotation to the second camp at 21,000 feet in mid-April, Russell struggled significantly. The climb from base camp took him nearly 8 hours, roughly 2 hours longer than average. He arrived at camp exhausted, with a severe headache and nausea. His oxygen saturation was measured at 72%, low but not critical. The guide recommended they descend the next morning and rest for several days. Gerald disagreed. He noted that Russell's oxygen saturation had been 75% at base camp, so the current reading wasn't much worse. He argued that Russell just needed time to adjust. They stayed at the second camp for an additional night. Russell's condition improved slightly, and they descended on the third day. The guide made a note in his expedition log that Russell was acclimatizing slower than expected and might not be ready for a summit attempt. During the second rotation in late April, they climbed to the third camp at 23,500 feet. Russell developed a persistent cough and reported feeling dizzy when he stood up quickly. The guide examined him and suspected early signs of pulmonary edema, fluid beginning to accumulate in his lungs. He recommended Russell descend immediately and consider ending his expedition. Gerald refused to accept that assessment. He pointed out that Russell wasn't coughing up pink frothy sputum, which would indicate severe pulmonary edema. He insisted Russell was just experiencing normal altitude effects. Gerald paid for additional oxygen bottles, 6 extra beyond what the expedition company provided. He also hired an additional climbing assistant, whose sole job would be to help Russell during the summit push. The guide agreed to continue but documented his concerns in writing, and had both Gerald and Russell sign an acknowledgement that they were proceeding against medical advice. On May 17th, the team moved from the third camp to the fourth camp on the South Col at 26,000 feet. The fourth camp is essentially a collection of tents perched on a barren, windswept plateau of rock and ice. Most climbers spend less than 12 hours there, just enough time to rest briefly before the summit push. The weather forecast showed a narrow window of opportunity. Clear skies and relatively low winds on May 18th, but a storm system moving in from the west by the evening of the 19th. Multiple expedition teams were planning to summit on the 18th, which meant the route would be crowded. The guide advised a conservative approach, begin the summit attempt at 9 p.m. on May 17th, which would put them on top around dawn if everything went perfectly. More importantly, he established a firm turnaround time of 1 p.m. on May 18th, regardless of their position on the mountain. The turnaround time was non-negotiable, whether they were 100 feet from the summit or 1,000 feet. If they weren't already descending by 1 p.m., they would turn around. Gerald challenged this. He wanted to start earlier, at 8 p.m. instead of 9 p.m., to ensure they had maximum time. He argued that with the extra oxygen bottles he'd purchased and the additional climbing assistant, they had more margin than other teams. The guide explained that starting earlier wouldn't necessarily mean summiting earlier. It would just mean they'd be climbing during the coldest part of the night and potentially wearing themselves out. But Gerald was insistent. After a long discussion, the guide reluctantly agreed to an 8 p.m. departure, but emphasized the 1 p.m. turnaround time even more strongly. By the time they began gearing up at 7:30 p.m. on the May 17th, Russell was already exhausted. His movements were slow and uncoordinated. He fumbled with his harness buckles and needed help clipping his carabiners correctly. Gerald appeared energized despite the lack of sleep. He checked his watch obsessively and kept recalculating their pace. He'd mapped out specific waypoints and times they needed to hit to stay on schedule for a safe descent, factoring in the turnaround time the guide had established. At 8:15 p.m., they left camp and began the final ascent. Gerald, Russell, the guide, and the additional climbing assistant all clipped into the fixed ropes and started climbing. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour, strong enough that climbers had to stop moving and brace themselves when the strongest gusts hit. Above them, a line of headlamps from dozens of other climbers snaked up the mountain, everyone racing toward the same goal during the same narrow weather window. The climb progressed slower than Gerald had calculated. The route was severely congested with climbers bottlenecked at the fixed ropes. By 11 p.m., they'd been climbing for nearly 3 hours but had only gained about 800 feet. They were behind schedule. Gerald grew visibly impatient. He started pushing past other teams whenever the terrain allowed it, moving off the fixed ropes to climb on unprotected ground. This was technically possible, but significantly more dangerous. A slip without being clipped to the rope meant an uncontrolled fall. Russell followed mechanically, doing whatever his father did. The guide repeatedly called out for them to stay on the fixed ropes, but Gerald ignored him. By 2 a.m., they had reached a plateau called the balcony at 27,500 feet. The balcony is a relatively flat section where climbers typically stop to change oxygen bottles and assess their condition. Russell was moving mechanically, his steps uneven and his breathing labored, even with supplemental oxygen flowing at 2 liters per minute. When they stopped at the balcony, Russell immediately sat down in the snow. He didn't speak, he just sat staring at the ground. The guide checked Russell's oxygen supply and found he was consuming it faster than planned. Each oxygen bottle should last approximately 4 hours at 2 liters per minute. Russell had gone through his first bottle in 3.5 hours. The guide checked Russell's pupils with a headlamp. They were reactive but sluggish. The guide stated clearly that they needed to turn back. Russell's oxygen consumption rate meant they wouldn't have enough for both the ascent and descent. More concerning, Russell's slow responses suggested early cerebral edema. Gerald checked his watch and calculated that they were 30 minutes behind his planned pace, but could make it up. He stated they were continuing. Russell offered no opinion. He just sat in the snow. They changed oxygen bottles and resumed climbing at 2:25 a.m. The route from the balcony to the south summit gets progressively steeper and more exposed. The terrain angles up at 40 to 50 degrees in places, steep enough that climbers are bent forward, pulling themselves upward hand over hand along the fixed ropes. A fall here would likely be stopped by the fixed rope, but the sudden shock load could break ribs or dislocate shoulders. At 3:30 a.m., approximately 28,000 feet, Russell stopped climbing. He stood clipped to the fixed rope, not moving forward or backward, just standing. Gerald climbed back down to him and physically pushed him from behind. Russell started moving again. This pattern repeated every 15 to 20 minutes. At 5 a.m., they reached the south summit at 28,700 feet. The south summit is a false peak. It looks like the top from below, but the true summit is still visible beyond it, connected by a narrow ridge. Dawn was breaking, revealing the final ridge to the true summit. A narrow, exposed traverse with sheer drops of thousands of feet on both sides. The Hillary Step, a near vertical rock face that climbers must ascend using fixed ropes, was visible along the ridge. Russell collapsed onto the snow at the south summit. He sat slumped forward, his head hanging down. His words were slurred and barely intelligible when he tried to speak. The guide crouched beside him and performed a coordination test. He held up fingers and asked Russell to count them. Russell's count was wrong. The guide asked Russell to stand and walk in a straight line. Russell stood but immediately stumbled sideways before catching himself. These were clear signs of cerebral edema, fluid building up in Russell's brain, causing it to swell and press against his skull. The condition would only worsen with continued exposure to altitude. The guide stated firmly that Russell had high-altitude cerebral edema and needed to descend immediately or he would die. There was no ambiguity in his statement. This wasn't a precaution or a recommendation. It was a medical emergency. Gerald gripped Russell's shoulders and pulled him to a standing position. They were an hour behind schedule, but the summit was visible, less than 500 vertical feet above them. Gerald calculated they could reach it in 90 minutes and be descending by 6:45 a.m. He stated they were continuing. The guide made a decision. He used his radio to contact base camp and reported the situation. He stated clearly that Russell was showing definite signs of cerebral edema, that he had recommended immediate descent, and that Gerald was refusing. He stated he was attempting to take Russell down. Gerald physically positioned himself between the guide and Russell, blocking the descent route. The guide realized he was dealing with someone beyond reason. The guide spoke directly to Gerald. He stated that he was descending, that they needed to follow him immediately, and that if they continued upward, they would die. He waited for a response. Gerald turned away and pulled Russell to his feet. He began moving Russell toward the ridge leading to the summit. The guide stood at the south summit for approximately 3 minutes, watching them move away. Then he began descending alone. The guide would later state in his formal testimony that he knew he was leaving 2 men who would almost certainly die. He also knew that attempting to physically force them down against their will was impossible at that altitude. He barely had enough strength to get himself down, let alone wrestle with a client who outweighed him. He radioed base camp again at 5:20 a.m. and reported that he was descending alone and that Gerald and Russell were continuing toward the summit despite his warnings. Gerald and Russell continued toward the summit. The traverse from the south summit to the Hillary Step is along a knife-edge ridge. In places, it's barely 3 feet wide, with drops of 8,000 feet to the left and 10,000 feet to the right. Fixed ropes run along this section, but they're anchored only every 50 to 100 feet, meaning a fall could result in a significant pendulum swing into the rock face. Russell's movements had become completely robotic. He would clip his carabiner forward along the fixed rope, take 3 or 4 steps, stop, then clip forward again. He wasn't looking around or responding to anything Gerald said. He was simply following the rope. The climbing assistant who had been hired to help Russell moved ahead and behind him, trying to guide him along the safest line, but Russell seemed barely aware of his presence. They reached the Hillary Step at 6:40 a.m. The Hillary Step is a near vertical rock face approximately 40 feet tall that climbers must ascend using fixed ropes. It's the final significant obstacle before the summit. Climbers clip into the rope and essentially haul themselves straight up, their feet scrabbling for purchase on the icy rock. The exposure is extreme. There's nothing but air for thousands of feet in every direction. Russell stood at the base of the Hillary Step, looking up at it, but not moving. The climbing assistant clipped into the rope ahead of him and started climbing, demonstrating the technique. Russell watched but didn't follow. Gerald climbed up behind Russell and physically positioned Russell's hands on the rope. Russell began climbing slowly. The ascent took him 12 minutes, roughly 3 times longer than normal. At 7:35 a.m., they reached the summit ridge. The true summit was visible approximately 200 feet ahead along a gentle upward slope. Other climbers were on the summit, taking photos. The route was crowded. At least 20 climbers had summited within the previous hour. At 8:30 a.m., Gerald and Russell reached the summit of Mount Everest at 29,029 feet. Gerald spent 15 minutes taking photographs with multiple cameras and recording video footage. He positioned Russell in various poses, though Russell sat motionless most of the time, unresponsive to questions or commands. They began descending at 8:45 a.m. Gerald had summited 3.5 hours past the safe turnaround time the guide had established. They were now facing a descent of more than 3,000 vertical feet back to the 4th camp, and Russell could barely walk. The descent was catastrophically slow. Russell fell twice in the first 30 minutes. Both times he simply lost his balance on flat ground and collapsed. The climbing assistant and Gerald would haul him back to his feet and point him down the mountain. By 10 a.m., they had reached the south summit. They descended only 330 vertical feet in 90 minutes. At 10 a.m., Russell collapsed on the narrow ridge between the south summit and the main summit. He went down onto his hands and knees, then slumped onto his side. Gerald and the climbing assistant tried to lift him. Russell wasn't unconscious, but his legs simply would not respond to commands from his brain, a clear sign that cerebral edema had progressed to critical levels. Gerald used his radio to call for help. He reached base camp and reported their position and situation. Base camp contacted other expedition teams on the mountain. 3 teams had climbers above their position, but all were on their own descents. Base camp asked those teams if anyone could stop to assist. The response was uniform. Stopping at that altitude to help incapacitated climbers would put their own lives at critical risk. At 28,500 feet in the death zone, rescue is nearly impossible. People don't have the physical capacity to carry or drag another person. Even attempting it means risking oxygen depletion, exhaustion, and death. Gerald and the climbing assistant tried dragging Russell. The effort left both of them gasping for air despite their oxygen masks. The climbing assistant checked his own oxygen supply. He had approximately 45 minutes remaining. He informed Gerald he needed to descend or his own life would be in danger. Gerald told him to leave one of his oxygen bottles. They continued descending. The storm system was moving in earlier than forecasted. By 10:45 a.m., clouds were beginning to build from the west. Visibility was still reasonable, but the wind was increasing. Gerald continued trying to move Russell. He would drag him a few feet, rest while gasping for air, then drag him a few more feet. At 11:30 a.m., The storm hit with full force. Visibility dropped from miles to less than 10 feet within minutes. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour, strong enough that climbers had to crouch low to avoid being knocked off the ridge. Snow began falling horizontally, driven by the wind. Gerald tried his radio but got only static. Either the radio had failed in the cold, or the storm was blocking the signal. By 12:15 p.m., Russell stopped breathing entirely. Gerald felt for a pulse at Russell's wrist through his thick gloves, but couldn't detect one. He pulled off his glove to try again with his bare hand, a catastrophic decision at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked Russell's neck for a carotid pulse. He found nothing. Russell was dead. Gerald, now alone and disoriented in whiteout conditions, attempted to descend. He clipped into the fixed rope and began moving downward. Gerald made it approximately 200 feet down from where Russell lay, then he stopped. Another climber descending behind him later reported seeing a figure clipped to the fixed rope, slumped forward and motionless. Gerald's oxygen supply had been exhausted. Without supplemental oxygen at 28,500 feet, death occurs within 1 to 3 hours. By 3 p.m., he was dead from a combination of hypoxia, hypothermia, and exhaustion. His body remained clipped to the fixed rope, suspended in a seated position. The storm continued through the evening of May 18th and into May 19th. On May 20th, conditions improved enough for teams to assess the situation. A recovery team consisting of experienced high-altitude climbers reached the ridge where Russell and Gerald had died. Both bodies were located exactly where they'd last been seen. Russell was found at 28,650 feet, lying near the fixed rope. Gerald was 200 feet below at 28,450 feet. The recovery team determined that recovery was not feasible. At that altitude, moving bodies requires extraordinary effort and risk. The team would have to risk their own lives to retrieve remains, and the physical effort required would likely result in additional deaths. Russell's death was attributed primarily to cerebral edema, with contributing factors of oxygen depletion and hypothermia. Gerald's death was attributed to hypoxia and hypothermia after his oxygen supply was exhausted. Contributing factors for both deaths included delayed descent, well past established turnaround times, continued ascent despite clear medical symptoms requiring immediate evacuation, and inadequate preparation for extreme altitude mountaineering. A private memorial service was held in Colorado, attended by family and close friends. The guide who descended alone submitted a detailed incident report to the expedition company. The company made no public comment on the deaths or any resulting policy changes. It was September 3, 2018, at Camp 4 on Everest's South Col. Bitter winds swept the exposed ridge, and climbers huddled in their tents for survival. Shelter and oxygen systems were critical, as even brief exposure to the thin air could turn deadly. At this altitude, failure of equipment or protection left no margin for error. Nathan Boris, 42, a petroleum geologist from Anchorage, had been climbing with expedition leader Maria Santos for 3 years. Boris had recently discovered Santos was embezzling funds from client expeditions, skimming tens of thousands of dollars, and he had confronted her at base camp with bank records and receipts. He demanded repayment and threatened to expose her upon return. Known among the team for his meticulous record-keeping and level-headed approach, Boris had always prioritized safety, following every protocol despite the extreme environment. Santos, realizing Boris's evidence could destroy her career and result in criminal charges, had grown increasingly paranoid and resentful in the days leading up to the summit push. The night before the incident, other climbers noticed Santos lingering near Boris's tent under the pretense of checking on team members. She had been overheard making statements like, "Eliminating problems permanently," and "People who threaten me don't get to leave." Using a climbing knife, she cut slashes in Boris's tent walls to create lethal wind tunnels and removed his supplemental oxygen bottles, each containing a full supply for survival at 26,000 feet. The sabotage was timed deliberately, late enough that Boris would be asleep and unable to respond, early enough that rescue in darkness and extreme weather would be impossible. Brooks awoke to the shredded tent and missing oxygen, the -30 degrees Fahrenheit wind immediately battering him, as he realized he was exposed with no protection. Panic surged as his body temperature began to drop, and violent shivering overtook him. His fingers and toes went numb within minutes, making it nearly impossible to grip or manipulate his climbing poles. Confusion and dizziness set in quickly, and every movement became a monumental effort. He stumbled blindly across the snow, desperate for shelter, slipping repeatedly on icy patches while trying to find another tent. Each gust of wind cut through the tattered fabric of his tent, driving snow into his face and frosting his goggles, further disorienting him. As hypothermia worsened, Brooks's steps grew uncoordinated and erratic. He began moving in circles, losing awareness of direction and the distance to safety. His GPS tracker showed him covering barely 200 yards over nearly 50 minutes. His attempts to reach help thwarted by exhaustion and freezing temperatures. Each breath was shallow and painful, the thin air 1,000 feet, magnifying every struggle. Meanwhile, Santos watched from her own tent, observing his erratic movements on her device. She commented coldly, "Problem solved," as Brooks finally collapsed into the snow, unable to continue, the merciless altitude and brutal exposure ensuring there would be no recovery. Efforts to locate Boris were delayed, as Santos reported him missing at 6 a.m., claiming he had left for an unsanctioned solo summit attempt. Search teams were limited by extreme weather, steep terrain, and the assumption he had descended toward Camp 3. Boris's body was discovered 18 hours later, collapsed in a shallow depression just yards from Camp 4. The coroner determined death from severe hypothermia and exposure, with his core temperature recorded at 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Examination of his tent showed clean blade cuts, inconsistent with wind or accidental damage, and the missing oxygen bottles were found in Santos' possession. Santos's guiding permits were revoked by Nepalese authorities, but she left the country before any criminal charges could be filed. Official reports listed the incident briefly as exposure, death at Camp 4 after equipment failure, omitting the sabotage. Boris's records documenting her embezzlement were never recovered, leaving the fraud unprosecuted. Among climbers, the story circulated as one of calculated vengeance, a guide who eliminated the only witness to her crimes, weaponizing the extreme conditions of Everest to turn a confrontation over money into a fatal act of revenge. It was May 9th, 2016, and base camp on the south side of Mount Everest sat at 17,600 feet on a shifting moraine beneath the Khumbu icefall. The air was thin but stable, and the camp functioned as a dense staging ground for multiple expeditions preparing for summit rotations. Ruiz Sedan was a 41-year-old structural engineer from Portland, Oregon, who treated Everest as a systems problem defined by risk, redundancy, and controlled failure limits. He trained for over a year with structured endurance work, altitude conditioning, and detailed study of oxygen systems and expedition logistics, viewing equipment reliability as critical as physical readiness. From the research I did on his background, that level of preparation is genuinely rare. Most climbers don't treat oxygen systems the way an engineer would treat load-bearing calculations. Having previously summited Denali, Aconcagua, and Cho Oyu, he approached Everest as a calculated escalation in technical complexity and was highly selective in choosing an operator, focusing on oxygen certification standards and operational transparency. Kies Rosette was a 36-year-old high-altitude nurse from Denver, Colorado, with climbing experience across the Andes, Himalayas, and Karakoram. Her medical background in respiratory care gave her a precise understanding of oxygen saturation, hypoxia, and altitude deterioration, which shaped both her training and risk assessment. She had completed multiple high-altitude ascents above 22,000 feet and chose her Everest expedition based on its stated medical preparedness, oxygen redundancy, and guide safety protocols. Thomas Freeland, 47, had guided Everest expeditions for 11 seasons, with 6 summits as a guide and 2 as a client. He was regarded as competent and efficient, known for managing logistics tightly and moving clients through the mountain without major incidents, though often described as distant and transactional within the guiding community. By 2016, he operated a small Nepal-based expedition company under significant financial strain following declining bookings after the 2014 and 2015 disruptions. To stay solvent, he introduced cost-cutting measures, most notably he's altering the oxygen supply. And that right there is the sentence that changes everything in this story, because every death that follows traces back to that one financial decision. He sourced cylinders refilled in Kathmandu through improperly maintained compressor systems where trace carbon monoxide contamination from engine exhaust and poor filtration could persist, then relabeled them as certified. He allocated true medical-grade oxygen only for critical summit phases, while using these unregulated cylinders during acclimatization and rest periods, treating oxygen supply as a managed variable rather than a fixed safety standard. The expedition followed a standard rotation to Camp 1 and Camp 2 before the summit push, with Vreeland and Sherpa guide Pemba Dorje briefing clients on oxygen use, regulator checks, and flow rates while presenting the system as fully certified. Ruiz inspected his oxygen equipment carefully, verifying pressure, regulator function, and mask seal, with all readings appearing normal. Keyes performed a similar check, noting only minor regulator stiffness she attributed to cold. The cylinders matched documentation, and neither climber had means to verify gas purity in the field. Stay with me here, because this is the part that kept bothering me the deeper I got into this. The first rotation crossed the Khumbu Icefall, a technical route of ladders, seracs, and crevasse crossings maintained by the Icefall doctors. No oxygen was used at this stage. Both climbers performed strongly, maintaining steady pace and recovery, reaching Camp 1, spending a night for acclimatization, and returning to base camp without incident. The second rotation moved through the icefall and across the western CWM to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet. The CWM is a long glacial basin with extreme temperature swings, and oxygen use began here. During this phase, the first subtle irregularities in equipment performance and physical response began to appear. Keyes first noticed an inconsistency in her breathing during the traverse, feeling a greater than expected effort at her set oxygen flow rate. Despite checking her regulator, mask seal, and cylinder pressure, each appearing normal, there was no clear mechanical explanation. She attributed it initially to normal altitude variability, later noting it in her expedition journal after Pemba Dorje adjusted her flow rate slightly, which improved her comfort enough for her to complete the rotation to Camp 2 without further issue. Reading that journal entry detail stopped me cold. Ruiz experienced a different but parallel anomaly. Although his oxygen saturation remained within acceptable range, he found his exertion levels higher than expected based on prior climbs at similar altitude, with slower recovery during rest stops and a generalized reduction in efficiency. At Camp 2, he raised the discrepancy with Vreeland, who attributed it to normal acclimatization, variability, and differences between Everest and Ruiz's previous climbs. The explanation was plausible, and Ruiz accepted it, though he privately noted that the fatigue felt structurally different from prior high-altitude experiences. Unbeknownst to the clients, Vreeland was actively reviewing oxygen consumption data from the rotation, cross-referencing it against his internal tracking of cylinder composition and distribution. The results aligned with his expectations. Performance variation was present but remained within the threshold of natural physiological fluctuation, allowing the system of mixed oxygen supply to remain undetected while continuing to influence the client condition in subtle, cumulative ways. When I found this in the investigation documents, I had to reread it twice, because what he's describing is essentially a calibrated deception, engineered to stay invisible. The team returned to base camp after the second rotation on May 15th for a planned rest period, a standard phase in the acclimatization cycle designed to allow recovery at lower altitude while preserving physiological adaptations gained at higher elevations. Both Ruiz and Keyes used the time to rest, refuel, and prepare their systems and equipment for the upcoming summit push, which expedition leaders across the mountain were anticipating would begin around May 19th or 20th, based on developing high-pressure weather window over the Tibetan Plateau. During this rest period, Keyes revisited her notes from the western CWM traverse, where she had experienced a brief but noticeable sensation of reduced oxygen efficiency. Although the issue had not persisted, she recognized the importance of evaluating it before entering the death zone, where any impairment in oxygen delivery could have severe consequences. She considered requesting a formal inspection of her equipment, but ultimately refrained, judging that the system had passed visual and functional checks, and that escalating a concern based on a transient observation could be dismissed as overcaution rather than clinical assessment. Instead, she made a specific request to lead Sherpa Pembadorje, asking that her oxygen cylinders for the summit push be drawn from the same batch used by the Sherpa team, trusting that their equipment would represent the highest reliability standards on the expedition. Her clinical instincts were working perfectly. The system around her just wasn't. Pembadorje acknowledged the request and indicated he would ensure it was arranged. However, the investigation later found no evidence that this request was implemented as intended. The cylinders issued to Kias for the summit push were not sourced from the Sherpa batch, and their distribution followed the expedition's internal allocation system rather than her specific instruction. The summit push began with a departure from base camp, moving through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 2 on the first stage. After a rest day for recovery and acclimatization, the team continued upward onto the Lhotse face, a steep and continuous wall of blue ice rising roughly 4,000 vertical feet toward Camp 3. Climbing on fixed ropes at extreme altitude while using supplemental oxygen placed sustained physiological strain on both Ruiz and Kias. Although both completed the ascent without external assistance, their effort levels were noticeably higher than expected for their conditioning, indicating increasing stress as the expedition moved deeper into higher altitude terrain. At Camp 3, the team entered a short but critical rest phase before the move into the death zone. Sleep at this altitude was already limited by disrupted breathing cycles, but both climbers experienced poorer than expected recovery. Ruiz repeatedly woke feeling breathless unless his oxygen flow was increased, while Kias developed a persistent headache that she attributed to dehydration despite adequate fluid intake. Neither symptom was severe in isolation, but both indicated compromised recovery. Individually, their vital signs remained within acceptable expedition ranges. Oxygen saturation at rest was adequate, heart rates were elevated but not alarming, and basic cognitive checks showed no immediate impairment. However, the cumulative effect of repeated nights at altitude with oxygen delivery that was subtly below certified standards had begun to create an unseen physiological deficit that would only become apparent under the extreme stress of the death zone. If you've watched my other videos on high altitude failures, you'll recognize this pattern. The damage is always invisible until the moment it isn't. The team reached Camp 4 at 26,300 feet after a 6-hour ascent from Camp 3. Situated on the south col between Everest and Lhotse, it offered no natural shelter, with tents anchored against constant wind and exposure. Temperatures hovered around -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill making conditions even harsher. At this altitude, the body operated near its limits. Even with supplemental oxygen, blood oxygen saturation remained low, and both cognitive and physical performance were reduced. Slower decision-making, weaker recovery, and lower exertion tolerance. These effects accumulated gradually in the death zone, often without immediate awareness. Both Ruiz and Kias rested at Camp 4 through the afternoon, using supplemental oxygen at standard expedition flow rates while conserving supply for the summit attempt. The plan was to depart around midnight, reach the summit in the early morning, and return before afternoon weather deterioration, within a narrow and critical weather window, forecast to close after May 20th. Before the summit push, Freeland conducted final checks across the tents, adjusting regulators and cylinder pressures as needed. His oxygen distribution followed an internal tracking system developed over the expedition, allocating supply based on planned phases of the climb. By this point, both Ruiz and Kias had already accumulated a physiological deficit from days of oxygen delivery that had not consistently met certified standards. This deficit was not visible in their readings at Camp 4. Oxygen saturation, heart rate, and basic cognitive tests still appeared within acceptable ranges. However, their physiological reserve, the body's capacity to withstand extreme stress, had steadily diminished. In the death zone above 26,000 feet, where recovery is impossible, this reduced margin became critical. The summit push began shortly after midnight as the team left Camp 4 in darkness. Headlamps illuminated the southeast ridge under temperatures near -30 degrees Fahrenheit and relatively light winds, considered optimal conditions. The route ascended through the triangular face, then along the southeast ridge to the balcony at 27,600 feet, continuing toward the south summit summit, and finally the true summit at 29,032 feet. The team moved in a slow, spaced column, with Sherpa guides positioned between clients for monitoring and support. Vreeland followed at the rear, observing the group without direct interaction. The pace remained steady and controlled, reflecting standard high-altitude rhythm with minimal movement, short rests, and tightly managed oxygen use. Keyes showed the first clear signs of deterioration around 27,200 feet, roughly 2 hours into the ascent. Her pace began to lag slightly behind the climber ahead of her, and her movement became less precise. Delayed ice axe placements, longer pauses between steps, and reduced rhythm in rest intervals. Pemba Dorje, positioned near her, recognized early indicators of hypoxic decline and checked her oxygen system. The regulator was functioning at the correct flow rate, but increasing it produced only a marginal improvement. By 27,500 feet, her condition had worsened to the point of self-awareness. She reported difficulty maintaining sequential thought and coordination, recognizing it clinically as cognitive impairment consistent with cerebral hypoxia. That detail, that she could still name what was happening to her, is one of the heaviest things in this entire story. At that altitude, this was a critical threshold, and the decision was made to turn her around. However, the descent did not begin immediately. Due to reduced Sherpa staffing on the summit push, a logistical delay occurred while guides were reassigned from the ascent line. During this approximately 25-minute delay, Keyes remained stationary at 27,500 feet, exposed to extreme cold and continuing oxygen limitation. Without movement, her physiological state did not recover. Instead, the accumulated deficit persisted under static conditions. The momentary delay at that altitude did not create a new failure event, but it prevented any physiological recovery window, locking in the impairment that had already developed during the ascent. Ruiz continued upward with the remaining members of the team after Keyes was turned around. His condition was deteriorating, but not yet critical. His pace had slowed and his rest intervals had lengthened, but he remained coherent and capable of following guide instructions. At approximately 27,600 feet, he reached the balcony at around 3:15 a.m. and paused for a scheduled break to rest and change oxygen cylinders before the final push toward the south summit. The balcony served as a standard staging point on the southeast ridge, where climbers typically exchanged depleted oxygen cylinders for fresh ones carried up in advance by Sherpa support. The procedure was routine and tightly controlled, with cylinders selected from pre-positioned caches and swapped under guide supervision to maintain continuity of oxygen supply in the final ascent phase. Ruiz's cylinder was replaced during this stop. The replacement came from the balcony cache prepared during the expedition's summit setup phase and appeared identical to the certified medical-grade equipment in both labeling and pressure readings. The exchange itself took only a few minutes, and once complete, Ruiz resumed the ascent toward the south summit. What would later emerge in the investigation was that the replacement cylinder had been altered during processing through the expedition's supply chain. From what I found in the post-incident filings, this specific cylinder was traceable, and that trace led directly back to the Kathmandu intermediary. Instead of containing uniformly certified medical-grade oxygen, it held a cylinder that had been contaminated during refilling in Kathmandu, where carbon monoxide had been introduced in trace amounts through compressor exhaust infiltration and an inadequate filtration. At altitude, this created a toxic breathing environment in which oxygen readings and pressure remained misleadingly normal, while effective oxygen transport in the bloodstream was progressively impaired. This change did not affect pressure readings or external indicators, meaning the cylinder still appeared fully functional under standard field checks. However, the usable oxygen delivered per breath was lower than expected, creating a widening gap between Ruiz's physiological needs and his actual oxygen intake at extreme altitude. In the initial stages after the cylinder change, Ruiz's decline was not immediately obvious. His pace remained slow but stable, and his responses during radio and verbal checks were still coherent. Oxygen saturation readings during brief stops remained within acceptable expedition ranges. However, as he moved above 27,600 feet, reduced oxygen delivery compounded existing physiological strain, steadily eroding his remaining functional reserve. Roughly 45 minutes later, his condition worsened sharply. He required multiple breaths per step, consistent with insufficient oxygen delivery for exertion at extreme altitude. After stopping at a fixed rope anchor, He remained bent forward, breathing heavily, while Tashi confirmed the regulator was functioning and increased flow to maximum, producing only minimal improvement. At the south summit, a final crest before the narrow ridge to the true summit, Ruiz paused for assessment. He showed rapid, shallow breathing, delayed responses, and uncoordinated movement, with oxygen saturation at a critically low level. Tashi recommended immediate descent. With Ruiz unable to respond clearly, Tashi initiated the descent, clipping him into a short tether and guiding him back along the southeast ridge. From that point, Ruiz's movement was fully assisted, beginning the descent toward Camp 4 under conditions that made standard timing impossible. By around 28,200 feet, he had effectively lost independent mobility. His legs still bore weight and responded to directional pressure, but the fine motor coordination required for footing, balance, and rope transitions had failed. Tashi bore most of his weight through a short tether, guiding each step while also managing his own movement on steep, exposed terrain. The physical load was extreme, and he radioed for additional support. Due to already stretched guide distribution across the mountain, the response was delayed. It took roughly 40 minutes for 2 additional Sherpa guides to reach their position near 28,000 feet. By then, Ruiz had deteriorated further, no longer responding to verbal cues, breathing shallowly and irregularly, with oxygen saturation at critically low levels even under supplemental support. Together, the 3 guides managed a controlled, assisted descent back to the balcony at 27,600 feet over approximately 90 minutes. There, they replaced Ruiz's oxygen cylinder with a fresh unit from the descent cache. Unlike the ascent supply, this cache contained fully certified medical-grade cylinders, which produced a noticeable but limited improvement in his oxygen saturation over the following minutes. Too late, too little, and the frustrating thing is that the correct oxygen existed on that mountain the entire time. However, the improvement was insufficient to restore functional independence, and his condition remained severely compromised as the descent continued toward lower altitude. The improvement from the fresh oxygen cylinder was not enough to reverse the damage already sustained. During the prolonged exposure above the balcony, Ruiz had developed severe high-altitude pulmonary edema, a condition in which fluid accumulation in the lungs disrupts gas exchange at the alveolar level. At that stage, even properly delivered supplemental oxygen could not fully compensate, because the limiting factor was no longer supply alone, but the body's reduced ability to transfer oxygen into the bloodstream. As the descent continued down the triangular face toward Camp 4, conditions grew more difficult, with increasing wind and persistent sub-zero temperatures. The 3 guides maintained an assisted descent for several hours, but Ruiz's condition continued to decline. His breathing remained shallow and irregular. Oxygen saturation failed to recover to sustainable levels, and his responsiveness diminished further as the physiological strain accumulated. Ruiz died during the assisted descent at approximately 28,700 feet. According to the guides present, his breathing gradually ceased without a distinct terminal event, making the exact moment of death difficult to determine in real time. His body could not be recovered. At that altitude, with worsening conditions and limited resources, the guides secured him over to the fixed rope system and continued their descent to Camp 4 once their own safety margins began to narrow. I sat with that for a long time before writing this section. Keys reached Camp 4 after a 3.5-hour assisted descent from 27,500 feet with Pemba Dorje and Nima Sherpa. Her condition was serious, with partial cognitive recovery and persistently low oxygen saturation despite maximum flow support. At Camp 4, she was placed under physician monitoring, but her response to oxygen remained limited and stabilized at unsafe levels for that altitude. She was later evacuated from Camp 4 after a delayed decision due to limited rescue capacity. The descent through Camp 3 and Camp 2 was slow and heavily assisted, with continued neurological decline despite oxygen and treatment. By the Khumbu icefall, she was intermittently unconscious with signs of advanced hypoxic brain injury. She collapsed during the descent and did not regain breathing. Her body was not recovered. Ruiz died during assisted descent at approximately 28,700 feet after irreversible deterioration. His breathing gradually stopped without a distinct terminal event, and his body was secured to the fixed rope system before the guides continued down. He has not recovered. The investigation found widespread failure of certified oxygen standards. Multiple cylinders had been refilled through improperly maintained compressor systems in Kathmandu, with evidence of carbon monoxide contamination linked to compressor exhaust infiltration and inadequate filtration. This created a consistent pattern of hypoxic injury that mimicked altitude deterioration, but progressed more rapidly and unpredictably during critical ascent phases. Refilling logs confirmed falsified gas records linked to a Kathmandu-based intermediary supplying the expedition operator. Internal communications from Thomas Vreeland referenced oxygen management and performance degradation thresholds at altitude, which investigators interpreted as awareness of systemic risk. Thomas Vreeland did not return from the upper mountain during post-summit operations. While assisting coordination near the South Col, he suffered acute cardiac distress, consistent with extreme altitude strain, and collapsed between high camps. He died before reaching a lower elevation. His body was not recovered, and no formal descent record exists beyond that point. It was April 8th, 2014, in the western CWM on Mount Everest. Climbers navigated a flat glacier valley riddled with hidden crevasses, where snow bridges could collapse without warning. Temperatures were freezing, the air thin, and every movement physically taxing. Roping together was standard protocol for safety, as falling into a crevasse without support almost always meant certain death. Loiselle Chan, 29, a medical resident from San Francisco, was traversing the glacier with guidance from her teammate Rebecca Trevo. Chan was an experienced rock climber, but relatively new to high-altitude mountaineering, relying heavily on Trevo's expertise. Unbeknownst to Chan, she had been dating Trevo's ex-husband, Dyson, for 6 months, a relationship that had contributed to Trevo's bitter divorce and loss of custody. Chan had no idea of Trevo's connection until base camp, where Trevo's anger toward her became evident. Rebecca Trevo, 35, a seasoned climbing guide, harbored deep resentment. She had lost her home and custody of her children and blamed Chan for disrupting her family. According to other climbers, Trevo became increasingly hostile toward Chan, making pointed remarks about homewreckers getting what they deserve. Trevo had been practicing knots and rope-cutting techniques under the pretense of reviewing rescue procedures, and the night before the incident, she was overheard threatening over satellite phone to make Dyson pay for what he's done. Trevo planned her revenge meticulously. She identified a section of the western CWM where deep crevasses made rescue nearly impossible. Guiding Chan to a particularly unstable snow bridge, Trevo positioned herself to act when Chan fell, carrying a razor-sharp climbing knife specifically for the purpose. The setup relied entirely on Chan trusting Trevo's guidance in a place where one mistake could be fatal. During the morning climb, Chan carefully stepped onto a seemingly solid snow bridge, spanning a narrow crevasse. The bridge creaked under her weight, small cracks forming at the edges as she tested her footing. Within seconds, the snow gave way beneath her boots, and she fell roughly 15 feet onto a ledge inside the crevasse. Her rope system, normally a reliable lifeline, was her only protection as she struggled to regain balance while gasping for breath in the thin, freezing air. The walls of the crevasse towered above and below her, jagged ice threatening to cut through clothing or skin with the slightest misstep. As Chan ascended the rope, Torres struck with deliberate precision, severing all fibers with a knife and sending them fluttering into the cold air. The sudden loss of her lifeline threw Chan off balance, and the brittle snow bridge beneath her gave way entirely. She plunged 180 feet into the crevasse, tumbling against icy ledges and jagged walls as her headlamp spun wildly and snow sprayed around her. The combination of deliberate sabotage and the collapsing bridge left no chance of survival, turning a recoverable fall into a calculated, fatal descent. Trevo's helmet camera captured her actions and chillingly recorded her saying, "Some problems solve themselves," before she radioed base camp, claiming a rope snapped under load. Rescue teams reached the site hours later, but the unstable ice and extreme depth made immediate recovery impossible. Chan's body was eventually retrieved 2 weeks later using specialized rigging systems. The coroner confirmed the cause of death as impact trauma and hypothermia, noting multiple fractures from striking ice walls, and forensic examination revealed clean knife cuts on the rope rather than natural wear or overload failure Trevo left Nepal shortly after the incident, claiming emotional trauma and cooperating minimally with authorities. Investigation was hampered by her licensed guide status and lack of eyewitnesses. A brief notice in Rock and Ice magazine listed the event as a crevasse fall, leaving the story's darker truth largely unknown. Chan's ex-husband, Dyson Trevo, received her life insurance payout and never learned that her death had been a calculated act of revenge, one climber exploiting trust in the high mountains to punish a personal betrayal. It was January 8, 2026, and social media was already telling the story of Everest's deadly first week. At Camp 4 on the South Col, at 26,000 feet, where the world's highest mountains give way to nothing but sky, one climber was preparing to add his name to the growing list of January casualties. Kyle Brennan was 29, a fitness influencer from San Diego who had built a business on adventure content and supplement endorsements. His feed was a curated collection of extreme experiences: skydiving, shark diving, ultramarathons, each post projecting fearless capability to his 2.3 million followers. Everest was supposed to be the ultimate addition to his portfolio. Friends noticed he talked about the climb in terms of content value rather than personal challenge. The summit wasn't a goal, it was a deliverable. His climbing experience was limited but real. He had summited Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Denali over the previous 3 years, each climb documented extensively for his audience. His technique was adequate, his conditioning excellent, and his determination to succeed on camera unwavering. What he lacked was the hard-won wisdom that comes from years of close calls, the understanding that mountains don't care about follower counts. His expedition was organized by a guiding company, specializing in clients with more ambition than experience. They were reluctant to accept a winter booking, but Kyle's payment and insistence overcame their reservations. They assigned him 2 experienced Sherpa guides and provided equipment exceeding standard requirements, hoping that support could compensate for conditions. The climb to Camp 4 had tested Kyle's capabilities, but not exceeded them. He moved more slowly than his Sherpa guides would have preferred, but he kept moving. His oxygen consumption was higher than average, and his technique showed room for improvement. But he reached the South Col in condition to attempt the summit, if the weather held. The weather was holding, barely. Winds were still strong by spring standards, but had dropped to levels that experienced winter climbers considered manageable. The temperature at Camp 4 was minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, brutal but not unprecedented, and visibility was good enough to navigate the route to the summit. Kyle departed Camp 4 at 10 p.m. on January 7th, accompanied by his 2 Sherpa guides. The climb through the night went reasonably well, though Kyle's pace was slower than his guides had hoped. He reached the balcony at 27,600 feet as dawn broke, then continued upward toward the south summit and the final ridge to the top. The summit push required every ounce of determination Kyle possessed. The wind sculpted the snow into knife-edged ridges, and the sun, when it finally rose, offered no warmth. Only a blinding glare off the endless white. Each step above 28,000 feet felt like moving through syrup. The altitude crushed his breathing into shallow gasps that never seemed to provide enough oxygen, despite the supplemental supply. The cold penetrated his expensive suit in ways he hadn't expected, finding seams and gaps that manufacturers had assured him didn't exist. His fingers and toes had gone numb hours ago, a condition he recognized as concerning, but couldn't address without stopping. And stopping at this altitude meant potentially never starting again. He reached the summit at 9:23 a.m. on January 8, 2026, becoming one of the youngest Americans to climb Everest in winter. The moment should have been pure triumph, the culmination of years building toward this content opportunity. Instead, Kyle felt only exhaustion and an immediate desire to descend before his body failed completely. But first, he needed footage. The decision to remove his gloves for a photograph would later be identified as the moment his survival timeline began its final countdown. Kyle wanted to capture the summit marker with his bare hands visible in frame, proof that he had actually reached the top. His Sherpa guides protested, warning that exposed skin would freeze within seconds at these temperatures, but Kyle insisted it would take only a moment. He had done this before on other summits, and the content value was worth a few seconds of discomfort. The photograph took longer than expected. Kyle's camera had been affected by the cold and responded sluggishly to his commands. His bare fingers fumbled with the device, trying to frame the shot correctly while the wind tore at his body. 15 seconds became 30, then 45, then over a minute as he struggled to capture an image that met his standards. When he finally replaced his gloves, the damage had already been done. The frostbite was immediate and severe, affecting all 10 fingers to varying degrees. More critically, the process of removing and replacing his gloves had disrupted the thermal equilibrium of his entire hand system, allowing cold to penetrate deeper than his gloves alone could address. Within 30 minutes of leaving the summit, Kyle realized he could no longer feel or effectively control his hands. The descent became a nightmare of deteriorating capability. Kyle could not manage his equipment properly, struggling with carabiners and rope systems that required dexterity his frozen hands could not provide. His Sherpa guides took over as much as possible, clipping and unclipping his safety systems while he focused simply on moving his feet. But on Everest's final ridge, there are moments when every climber must manage their own equipment, and Kyle's increasing incapacity was creating dangerous gaps in his protection. The fall happened at 27,200 feet, on a section where fixed ropes require clipping between anchor points. Kyle attempted to manage the transition himself, insisting he could handle it despite his guide's offers to assist. His frozen fingers could not properly secure the carabiner, and when he weighted the system, it failed to hold. He slipped, then tumbled, then began sliding down the steep face toward the 8,000-foot drop into the western Sidwi Rim. His Sherpa guides reacted instantly, one diving to grab Kyle's harness, while the other braced against the fixed line. The arrest was violent but successful. Kyle's slide stopped after approximately 40 feet, his body suspended by his harness while his guide stabilized. For a moment, it seemed recoverable, but the fall had caused additional damage. Kyle had struck his head against an ice formation during the slide, and while his helmet prevented a skull fracture, the impact caused a concussion that compounded his already impaired state. When his guides attempted to help him stand, he could not coordinate his movements. When they tried to guide him along the route, he could not follow instructions. He had become dead weight at 27,200 feet, and there was no realistic way to carry him down. The hours that followed were a desperate attempt to save a life, already beyond saving. Kyle's Sherpa guides constructed an emergency shelter and called for support, but the logistics of high-altitude rescue in winter made meaningful intervention impossible. A helicopter could not reach their position. Ground rescue from Camp 4 would take hours, and Kyle's condition was deteriorating faster than help could arrive. His core temperature was dropping as his body diverted resources from extremities to vital organs, and the head trauma was causing increasing confusion and loss of consciousness. Kyle Brennan died at 4:47 p.m. on January 8, 2026, approximately 7 hours after reaching the summit he had dreamed of conquering. His Sherpa guides remained with him until the end, providing what comfort they could as his body systems shut down one by one. The cause of death was recorded as hypothermia, secondary to incapacitating frostbite and head trauma, a cascade of failures that began with a photograph and ended with a young man dying on a mountain that had never cared about his follower count. The investigation found no equipment failures or guiding deficiencies. Kyle had been warned about the danger of exposing bare skin, had been offered assistance with his equipment, and had been provided with every reasonable support. The decisions that killed him were his own, made in pursuit of content that would never be posted. The danger wasn't dramatic. He was removing his gloves for a photograph. 3 deaths in the first 8 days of 2026. 3 experienced adults who believed they understood Everest's risks and had prepared accordingly. Their stories joined the mountain's long memory, where the wind erases footprints, but never the consequences. The mountain didn't change. The altitude, the cold, the risks, all remained the same. What changed was the presence of human beings who believed preparation could overcome what the mountain had already proven to be lethal. Dmitry Volkov had the equipment, but not the weather. Thomas Ashworth had the experience, but not the judgment. Kyle Brennan had the ambition, but not the wisdom. Everest in winter is not a challenge to be conquered. It is an environment that tolerates human presence only briefly and punishes mistakes with absolute finality. The first deaths of 2026 were not anomalies or surprises. They were the predictable result of human beings entering a space not designed for human survival and discovering that the mountain's rules apply equally to everyone who dares to climb.